start our discussion for this afternoon. So our topic for this afternoon is entitled
Yes,
Materials
ma'am.
for... Ay, sige. Thank you for the response. Sorry, ngayon ko lang narinig. So going back, thank you, Mama Londra, for the response as well. So our topic, as I was saying, for this afternoon is entitled Materials for Enhancing Listening and Speaking Skills. So for our objectives at the end of the lesson, the students should be able to identify accessible and available learning materials and choose appropriate learning materials for enhancing listening and speaking skills. So for our lesson for this afternoon, so it is said that the ultimate aim of teaching listening and speaking skills to students is not just for them to know the what and the how, but also the when. So what we are talking about here is it's not only important that we teach to our students, for example, when we are teaching the macro skills of listening and speaking, it's not enough, although these are also equally important, no? That we teach our student what to listen to or what to speak about. And of course, it's also important that we teach them how to speak and how to listen properly. But aside from that, it's also important, or it's also part of our objective in language learning, especially in teaching, listening, and speaking, that we teach our students when to listen and when to speak as well. So we will have examples later on regarding that kind of topic. So when na yan. So studies show that typically a person spends at least 70 to 80% of his time in some form of communication. So as supported by studies, RAW, we at least spend 45 to 40% of our time listening, whereas we spend naman 35 to 30% of our time speaking. So for example, that is true on our case or on your case as students, since usually ngayon you spend most of your time, kahit na online class na, you spend them listening to your instructors who are, of course, just like this one right now, who are giving you lessons or who are talking about different topics na related sa inyong subject. So aside from that, yung sinabi ko na 35 to 30% is spent speaking naman on your part. For example, when you are given tasks or opportunities, for example, mga activities wherein you are the ones who are reporting. So ganyan. So speaking and listening. So more talaga or majority of our time doon sa 70%, 70 to 80% is spent on listening. So even after or even beyond online classes, pag may tawag nito, pag may gustong ipagawa sa yung nanay mo, like running errands, so you have to listen. No, kung yari, oh nak, baka lanay dito lang sa tindahan. So you have to listen kung ano yung mga ingredients na pinapabili. So 70 to 80% of our time, we are always engaged in some form of communication. Kahit mag-isa lang tayo, for example, like kahit kayo lang mag-isa dyan sa kwarto nyo, you are engaged in some form of communication kasi nga nakikinig kayo sa klase, or kahit wala ng online class na nagpapahinga kayo, you are still engaged in some form of communication na nagsiscroll kayo sa Facebook, nagbabasa ng tweet, tumatawa ba kayo dyan sa mga TikTok videos na pinapanood nyo, you are chatting, for example, you are viewing, so still in some form of communication. So siguro yung 30 to 20% is allotted or allocated kumbaga for our rest, yung natutulog tayo. Kasi syempre wala kayong kausap pag natutulog kayo. So meron ba kayong kausap? Siguro kung may kausap pa kayo habang natutulog kayo, basi iba na siya. Kumbaga. So yan. Okay, sorry. So however, even though we listen more frequently, we are rarely taught how to listen consciously. So we know naman that there's a difference when we say na we listen and we are simply hearing something. Now perhaps some of you are simply hearing me right now but are not listening. Na naririnig nyo yung sounds but you are not paying attention to the content, kumbaga, or what is the message that I am trying to tell you, kumbaga. So there's that difference. So yun nga, this is also another issue that we are rarely taught how to listen consciously. So when we say or when we talk about listening consciously or yung conscious listening na tinatawag, ito yung time, kumbaga, wherein we listen intentionally. We are present in the communication process. na nakikinig talaga tayo. So I know that we are all guilty naman siguro of the times or moments, for example, na lang is micro-teaching nyo na day. Or for example, nung may mga reports pa kayo in face-to-face classes, na kayo yung susunod na reporter. So instead of listening to the reporter in front of you, hala, nag-report na ang reporter number 1, so kamo ang reporter number 2. Instead of listening, kumbaga hala na nag-practice na nga, okay, sa amo ni nga time, amo ni obrahon ko. Or kung nag-micro-teach pa, okay, after niya sini kung ako na ang micro-teacher sa amo ni nga parts ng activity is amo ni obrahon ko. So you are not paying attention, kumbaga, to what the speaker in front is saying or kung sino man dira ang micro-teacher because you are busy rehearsing, kumbaga, kung ikaw na ang pamangkoton. So yan yung, for example, conscious listening happens when you catch yourself na, ay, wala ko gapamati, sige. So you are conscious about it and then you turn your attention back to the speaker and you listen attentively. Yan yung conscious listening. You are kumbaga yun nga, conscious. You are able to realize nga ay wala ko gapamati. So now I have to listen, I have to understand, and I have to pay attention to the one talking in front. So kahit hindi siya sa classroom, for example, na context. Sometimes when we are simply talking to someone we know, a friend, siguro, a relative, or kung may kaaway ta, wala taga pamati kung anong argument nila. Kaya, sige, pag natapos ni siya wakal, kaya amo nang isabat ko sa iya. Amo yung ginaisip ta. Wala ta na we are not paying attention anymore kung ano man to ang argument sang aton nga kaistorya, kumbaga. So wala sang conscious listening. So yun nga, that's also one of the reasons why communication breaks down. Kasi nga hindi tayo, we do not listen consciously. We are always, kumbaga, ang isip lang natin ay ako nasunod. Saan ni siya matapos ka istorya. Kaya ako naman ang mas peak nga next. So kumbaga, so conscious listening is when you are intentionally listening and paying attention to the person who is talking to you. So in learning a language or in relation to language learning naman, listening is very vital or important because it's, of course, one's access to information and understanding, which is also a source of input. So yan yung bala mo, kumbaga, in learning a language, listening as our source of input. How are you, or for example, how do you expect to learn about something? Like for example na lang, language, how do you expect to learn a language if you will not listen? So siguro in general din naman, in the learning process, yung one part din or siguro one way to listen is to humble yourself rin, no? Na also admit na you don't have the monopoly of knowledge, na hindi lahat ng information alam mo. Kasi for example kayo, kung as students, di ba, hindi na siguro kayo makikinig sa akin if you already know everything. So for example, so that's also true for me, for both instructors and students, na hindi natin or wala tayong monopoly of knowledge ng lahat ng topics, anything under the sun. So there are still some things that we don't know that we could learn from each other, kumbaga, to and fro. So that's also yung tawag nito, general thought then in listening. So that's important in learning a language as well. How would you expect to learn about a language's grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation if you will not listen to an instructor or yung sa teacher nyo who is going to teach you about that specific language or yung target language na yan. So listening as a source of input as well. Yeah. So we have here as well, so many researchers claim that enhancing the speaking skill is strongly related to the student's progress in the listening skill. So this is according to Abus Nobar in 2017. So being an effective communicator goes beyond knowing the vocabulary, or pronunciation of a language. It also involves knowing what, how, and when to speak in given varied context. So yan yung sinabi natin kanina, na our aim when we are teaching these two macro skills, listening and speaking, it's not just the what and when, but not what and how rather, but also the when. So hindi lang naman puro cognitive na domain or hindi lang naman puro utak yung involved when we are trying to learn a language. Although those are important and needed talaga, it also requires yung sensitivity mo, kumbaga, or yung ability mo maki-feel kung saan ka dapat makinig and saan ka dapat mag-speak. No, yung when natin. When do we listen? When do we speak? Hindi man pwede nga all the time ikaw na lang ga-monopolize sang imo, sang istorya. Ikaw lang tanan. Hindi gid makasalot ang iban. So for example, in the real world or sa mga relationships nyo, for example, in the family, between friends, in the workplace later on, it's not, hindi siya nami nga trait nga ikaw lang pirmi ang nag-monopolize sang conversation. Kasi syempre, ang iban mo nga upod, for example, could also have something to say. May maambag man na sila. So hindi na sila makachamba nga mag-istorya kay ikaw na lang tanan. So it's not a good trait then to have, for example. So the same is true with listening, na there are times naman na although there are times that we have to listen lang talaga, there are times where you have to give your inputs as well. So it goes both ways for speaking and listening in order to become an effective communicator. So hindi hambal kay siya lang pirmi ang speak ay effective communicator gid ni siya, effective speaker gid ni siya. So it's not the standard naman. Nga kung sino lang ang pirmi nagawakal, siya lang ang effective communicator. So it's not. So we also have to be sensitive. Kumbaga, we also need to read the room and read the situation. Kung ay dapat ba ko mag-speak or kailangan ko ba mamati lang ko anay. So for example na lang, we have a situation na, for example, you have a friend or someone you know just lost their pet. No, for example, yung dog nila or cat nila na alam mo is very important to their lives, and then the said dog or cat or pet passed away. So for example, is it correct or is it appropriate to say to your friend na yan nga, ay sige lang besh, baka lang liwat sang bag-o nga ido or bag-o nga kuring. So do you think that is appropriate? Yes or no?
No po.
So why is it not appropriate?
Kasi ma'am, ano po, yung yung bonding, yung relationship na nabuo nyo sa pet ninyo is hindi po mapapalitan ng pagbili lang ng another pet. Iba po kasi yun.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am May. So that's correct, no, na alam mo na nga, for example, you already know that your friend treasures that pet, and then sasabihin mo lang, sige lang mag-move on lang, baka lang bag-ubwas. So do tanikitampa mo na lang tong friend mo, kay daw do amo man to gapon ang ginobra mo by saying that. So that's one situation then wherein you have to read the room if you have to speak ba or say something, and if yung sasabihin mo ba is maganda ba yung magiging effect niya or ano bang magiging consequence nun. So for example, in that situation, it's like telling someone who lost their child, no, sige lang, maislan nyo man na siya, himo lang kamuliwat bata. No, do ano na siya, do 3 dos nga candy lang sa tindahan. So syempre, it's not appropriate because bastos siya kay yun nga, someone is mourning or grieving pa the loss of someone important, and then you'll say that. So yan yung mga times wherein we have to decide when to speak, kumbaga. So another example could be when a friend, kumbaga, when a friend comes to you, no, and nag-vent sa imo or nag-grant nung nag-break na kami, amo na. So for example, or nag-grant about their problems. So for example, there are times ba na it's good to just listen, or do we always have to say something in order to comfort someone? Anyone? So, yes, Ma'am Kaday, do you have an answer po? Or na-on lang to?
Ma'am.
Yes po.
Ma'am, para sa ako, ma'am. Kay diskan pa, mabal mo, ma'am, nga natako to sa edad break sila, ma'am. Kahambak, puro nga i-comfort mo siya nga papatian mo siya sa rat niya, ma'am, or what. Pero nang maghambal ka sang something nga himo niya mag-is not appropriate, ma'am, kay hindi mo balaan kung ano ang sitwasyon mo. So, something like that.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am Shabrina. So that's correct, no? Sometimes it's better na lang that we don't say anything, or sometimes for our friends nga yung mga taong lumalapit sa atin to come for comfort, they find comfort in people who just have the ear to listen. So it's not necessary rin naman na may sasabihin talaga. Kasi sometimes yung sa side din ng nagbibigay or nagtatry na mag-give ng comfort, it's hard to pick the correct words din na sabihin sa kanila. Kasi sometimes baka, although good yung intention natin, baka masama na yung dating for the person na sasabihan din natin. Na for example, nag-rant siya sa imo about sa breakup niya sa iyang uyab or sa GFBF. Tapos ikaw man, kay mahambal ka panganan, kay sala mo gid na, kapila ka naging hambalan, nasala mo gid mirisi mo gid na, nga nag-amo sina. So instead of feeling comforted, do maglain pa siya nung ngagin ngud-ngud mo na gid sa itsura niya ang mga mali niya nga ginobra nga. For sure, balaan niya na no, nga ipamukha pagid kumbaga. So perhaps sometimes in our life, both as a friend and as someone as well, no nga, of course there are times in our life as well na tayo yung may problema, we only need someone who would listen, kumbaga. Since sometimes hindi rin natin alam kung ano yung sasabihin nila. So there are people as well na, for example, if someone tells them nga, ay nagka-problema, gid ko kay amo ni amo na. And then instead of saying something comforting, kay magsabat pa nga, okay lang na ako gani kay amo ni problema ko. So daw hindi man siya ma-relieve ang isa ka tao kung mabalaan niya nga mas dako ang problema sang isa ka tao. So wala man sang award nga, okay, ikaw may pinakadamo problema award. So wala man sang amo na nga award, no. Hindi man ni siya lumbaanay or competition. Wala man may nagatali, ay mas dako problema ni person B. Sige, hindi ka mag-share sang problema mo kay siya gani o gahipos lang. So yan. So yan yung ibang mga context or situations wherein yun nga, we have to be very careful, or ano na siya, more on affective na, no, na domain. Kasi you have to be sensitive. Kailangan ko ba talagang magsalita, or is it okay that I just simply listen? Yan, for example. So parang it's i-compare mo na lang siya sa mga situation nga, for example, may lamay, and then syempre kay ano siya, funeral siya. So for example, if you see someone wearing mga bright colors, nga mga red, mga pink ya, nag-yellow siya ya, balaan niya nga lamay. So what message does that give to the family of the bereaved, for example? Ano ba ang practice natin? For example, if may lamay or nang ilubong na, usually we wear
White.
White or black?
white or black,
Black.
no, to white or black to relay nga we are also in solidarity sa kanila, na they are grieving as well or praying for the tawag nito, repose of the soul. So kung makita ka dira yung abaw, nag bright pink ta na siya, naka yellow ta na siya, daw nalipay ta na siya. So the same lang na siya sa ano no, sa mga amo nga situation na ginhambal ta kaina. Na sometimes you don't have to say anything at all, or if we're going to say something, hambalon ta lang siya sa time nga ma-feel ta na or matansya ta nga tama na gito siya nga time maghambal. Kay basi magsipyat kita, mag-backfire pa sa aton. Yan. So yan po. So when to speak in given varied context, or when to listen as well in varied contexts. So we also have here some materials for listening. So we have here for a while. So listening materials that most teachers use are usually from mga course books, no, na may mga activities na kasali. So yung mga course book or yung mga textbooks or modules which has different activities that enhance listening skills. So I think you are familiar with these activities na rin naman, like your dictation, wherein the teacher, depende as well sa level or sa complexity na kaya na ng mga students, may sasabihin or babasahin na word, phrase, or sentence yung teacher, and then i-write down verbatim or word by word ng student. So we also have here your closed test, or yung parang fill in the blank na style, na siguro may the students first will listen to an audio clip, na siguro 1 minute na audio clip, and then after that they will fill out or answer this fill in the blanks na yung text is doon sa pinakinggan nila. So for example, yung pinakinggan nila is I am worried for my mother. So for example, ganun yung narinig na one sentence from the audio clip. So sa closed test, ang mangyayari is, for example, I am worried for my mother. That was one sentence that they listened to. I am blank for my mother. So ano yung sinabi kanina sa audio clip na word? So yan yung isusulat nila. So other sentences as well, na I have already blank my dinner. So yan. So usually yan yung pattern for your closed test. So listening, then writing. Ito naman yung dictogloss na tinatawag natin. So parang ano lang siya, variation ng dictation. Pero what happens is the students will listen to the teacher or the instructor who is reading a specific text or may plinay ba ang instructor na audio clip. And after that, the students will rewrite, hindi siya word by word, but more on paraphrasing, kumbaga, na dapat yung masulat or maproduce ng students is it has the same content pero hindi siya word by word nga katulad ng pinakinggan nila na audio clip. So we also have your pronunciation practice. Of course, we have already done this, no, nahalinsang nag-start pa lang ta to learn English from our younger years. From apple to mga foreign words, for example, na nai-encounter natin sometimes even up until now. Like yung ginamit natin in our past lessons na reservoir, na bakit, although ang spelling niya is V-O-I-R, why do we pronounce it as voir? Yan, so mga hiram or borrowed words in the English language. So we also have input from recorded scripted dialogues and monologues through recordings. So yan. So ito siya, these activities are considered by Tomlinson as yung mga scripted text daw kasi patterned nga siya, kumbaga, ng mga activities. So aside from that, si Tomlinson also provided a list of intake-rich materials and activities that we have here. So I'll just list down those activities kasi ano naman rin, understandable. So we have here, first, listening to the teacher, reading poems, short stories, or extracts or excerpts na tinatawag natin from novels. So excerpts lang. So these are usually mas appropriate siya gawin at the start of before the start of the lesson. So parang motivation or springboarding lang, kumbaga, na the students will listen to the teacher read a short poem or a short story na very short lang, na more or less 5 minutes, or extracts or excerpts from the novels. Kasi hindi naman pwede na basahin talaga ng teacher ang buong novel, no? Motivation lang man bala ni or springboarding daw na abtan taton siyam ma'am how. Sir, nga gintapos kita nakabasa ang novel. So excerpt lang, yung mga important lines lang na pwedeng gawan ng activities or may mapulot yung students. So listening to teachers delivering a scene from a play as well. So same lang, it's like reading lines or react out lang ng teacher. Listening to the teacher rather, telling jokes and anecdotes. So kasi, for example, telling jokes as well as one way of, or listening to the teacher tell jokes, that's also one way to understand, no, the language. Kasi sometimes there are jokes in English nga, ha? Anong meaning? Sini nga joke? Paki-explain daw nga, joke ni siya. No, may nagakadlaw ng iban, ikamu nga duha ng question mark pag buffer pa kamo. Kung nga siya karadlawan. So sometimes yung joke, hindi natin magigets kung bakit siya nakakatawa if we don't have a background, kumbaga, sa mga words or phrases, mga reference na ginamit. So anecdotes as well, or yung mga stories. So anecdotes, for example, these are the stories used by both teachers and students din, no, in yung mga stories are of course related to the lesson. So for example, if sa isang klase nyo, ang topic nyo is about flowers, for example, and then the teacher would say, that reminds me, nung bata pa ako, yung grandma ko nagtatanim siya ng roses, for example. So related sa lesson kasi flowers. So ganito ang ginagawa namin sa flowers, na ganito, ginakat or gina-remove ang thorns. For example, ganito, ganyan. So anecdotes are also a good way, kumbaga, to help both the teacher and the student na ma-extend, kumbaga, or ma-expound yung lesson kasi may connection. Pero yun lang, dito lang kasi piyat kisa kay si ma'am, amo ni ang lesson, nalingaw naka-share sang stories. Nag 1 hour na lang, puro na lang stories. Nalipat na magbalik sa subject matter or sa topic for the day. Udo roses lang man to amon nga lesson, nakaabot na tamon sa iya nga childhood. How may continuation pa daw next meeting, kumbaga. So we also have to do that in moderation. No, I know may mga memory siguro kayo na ganyan, na wala na hindi nyo madumduman ang lesson, kaya ang madumduman yung isang story sa life ni ma'am sir nyo. So yan. So we have to be careful lang with our anecdotes. So we also have there listening to classmates and peers, reading poems, telling jokes and anecdotes. Yan, for example, sa mga activities na ini-implement natin, na hindi naman lahat is kailangan talaga is nag-stick lang for the nga dapat amo lang ni istoryahan nyo, ha, nga amo lang ni. So we could also give time for them to reflect and to know their classmates better through yun nga, telling jokes with them, sharing anecdotes or stories. Nga ay si ma'am lang gali or si sir pwede mag-share stories. kami man mag-share with each other, kumbaga. Okay, so next we also have here listening to other learners reading aloud texts which they have enjoyed studying. So listening to others delivering a prepared speech on something that interests them. So for example, this is also, or you could have the variation na may pipilian or may options ang students. Kumbaga nga, okay, ito yung mga options ng topics for the day na may different speakers for each of this topic. So ano ang gusto ng class pakinggan for today. Kumbaga, so at least may consensus, and yun nga, mahook nga ang interest nila because nag-agree ang class na ito yung topic, kumbaga, or ang magde-deliver or ang topic ng speech to be delivered is something that interests the majority of the class. So we also have there watching sports events, news events, documentaries with commentaries in the target language. So for example, if you happen to watch ng a basketball game or a volleyball game or kahit anong sports pa dyan, or mga news events, yung mga documentaries na may mga commentaries siya. Sorry. So kindly wait for a while. So for example, sa ganyang mga instances, it's also helpful because it would also tawag nito, expound on the vocabulary ng mga bata or mga learners. For example, when we are watching a basketball game, syempre meron talaga diyang mga tawag niyan, mga men on the side na nagko-comment nga, okay, si player ganito looks like he's in a good mood today. Ganito ganyan ang game niya, ang stats niya is ganito ganyan. So that would also help the listeners or your learners to learn about the language or yung mga technical words na ginagamit in those different events. Like sa sports, ano yung mga words na naririnig nila, na dyan lang nila sa sports naririnig. For example, in the news naman, ano yung mga words na technical or exclusive lang na naririnig lang nila doon sa news na field or sector. Same with documentaries. Now, for example, they are watching a documentary about animals, about, for example, foxes. So they would expect na yung mga words na maririnig nila is related to how foxes are, anatomy ng foxes, ano ba ang habitat ng foxes, something science related, or perhaps yun nga, may relation sa foxes, which are animals. Yan. So listening to presentations, discussions, debates on topics relevant to the learner. So that's also helpful as well. Kindly wait for a moment. So aside from that, we also have here listening to advertisements, radio programs, and podcasts, music, and watching TV and films. Of course, that's helpful as well na yun ma-expose yung mga learners new to different types of media nga hindi lang man puro sa utod-utod nga clips, kumbaga. So they could also watch mga advertisement, no, kung ano ang mga pattern. For example, why is it na sa music is hindi ta kayo strict sa grammar? Na perhaps you happen to listen to a specific song. Na ay mali man yung grammar niya, hindi man tama nga line. So, pero namin siya pang matian, kaya bagay siya sa tune. So sometimes yan yung tinatawag natin na creative license, kumbaga, na although it's ungrammatical, pero the artist is granted that for the creativity, for the art, kumbaga. So bakit kung sa spoken, kumbaga, or sa mga spoken text or mga written text, we are very particular with grammar, pero ganyan nga. For example, sa mga songs, we are not. No? For example, yung sa Jonas Brothers na, when you look me in the eyes, yan. So parang something wrong or it's somehow ungrammatical yung title, kumbaga. So yan, some examples. And of course, engaging in discussion with their peers on controversial topics. So you could also ask your students to engage then na with each other or talk with each other, kumbaga, in order to talk about yung mga controversial topics like, for example, what is going on in the society or yung recently na Miss Universe, no, na pwede nila ma-compare. Na ay, sino ang bet mo dito sa top 5 nga answers? Kumbaga, nami ba ang answer ni Miss India? So diyan na magwa mga opinions, for example. So they could have a proper discourse, and of course, na-enhance din ang listening skill nila because they also try to pay attention to the opinion of their peers. Kasi yun nga, ito, for example, yung mga activities na to listed down by Brian Tomlinson are just some examples, kumbaga, of activities that would enhance the listening skills of our students. Kasi syempre, in order to enhance a specific skill, you have to be exposed to it frequently, no? Na paano mo or hindi mo man i-expect na kabalo ka na mag-Korean buwas kung wala ka gid gani nagtuon or wala ka man naghatag sang effort to learn about Korean language. So the same is true with your other language skills. In order for you to be an effective listener, you have to be frequently exposed to activities which of course require you to listen. Yan. So we also have here some other activities. So tapusin na lang natin to na part sa listening since our time is almost up. So you have here some sites na naman your mga online na mga or digital resources. So listening or watching lectures and speeches like your TED Talk. So for example, I'll share my screen for a little while. So for example, ito yung TED Talk. So in our past lesson, I have provided rin yung TED Talk na videos, kumbaga, which could help you in your teaching grammar. So you could also have yung mga TED Talks na which talks about different topics as well. So you have here, for example, 3 ways to prepare society for the next pandemic on a very timely and relevant. So you could also customize this since there are different topics na technology, entertainment, design. And we also have it available, makawin do tag-iya sang TED Talk. So you could also pick, kumbaga, pala, a specific language wherein you want to listen to. And yung duration. Na gusto mo ba is 6 minutes lang or 6 to 12 and so on and so forth. So we also have here, yung isa pa, isahin ko na lang. So itong English speeches is also the same. So from the link pa lang, it's obvious naman that it's all about speeches. So you could, for example, may ad pa. For example, ito, mga speeches of renowned na mga celebrities or personalities with big subtitles. Kasi sometimes it's hard for us to understand din yung speaker kasi sa accent, for example, or sa way of speaking niya. So ito, yan, may malalaki yung subtitles niya talaga. So the URLs are also provided then sa slide. Yan. So we also have here yung listen in a minute. So for example na lang, so marami siyang topics that you could choose from. So for example, you will have your class listen to this na 59. So minute gid siya, 1 minute lang. And aside from that, it's more on a resource na maka-benefit yung teacher. So you could have these activities, for example, sa mga lessons nyo sa susunod. So ito yung audio clip na papakinggan nyo sa kanila, and ito rin yung transcript. Ito yung text kumbaga nitong audio na to. Ito yung sasabihin sa audio na to. Sorry. And aside from that, may mga activities na pino-provide. Yan. So yung closed test na sinabi ko kanina. So for example, I blank how many accidents I've had in my life. So after listening once, twice, thrice to the audio clip, you could have them answer this listening the gap fill or closed test. So there are other activities as well. Correct the spellings. So for example, you have to rearrange these words na naka-underline in order to make the sentences correct. Yan. So this is just on one topic. So there are a lot of topics that you could choose from A, C until Z to siya. Okay, so we only have 2 minutes. So tatapusin ko na lang tong websites. So we also have here yung English listening lesson library online. So you could learn about different things. For example, itong idioms. Listening, kumbaga, you could also expose your students to the different idioms. Yung mga food-related idioms na piece of cake, for example. So what do we mean when we say piece of cake as an idiomatic expression? So diba, it means easy, madali. So how do you use the piece of cake in a sentence? Yan. So may video sila dito. So meron din mga health-related na idioms, for example. Yan. So iba-iba na mga idiomatic expressions. And lastly, or the last website that we have are sa mamaya pa to. So aside from those, kanina, tawag nito. I'll show you the PowerPoint muna. Yan. So ito yung mga websites na pinakita ko na sa inyo. So ginpakita ko na lang una ang website since the same lang naman. So aside from that, na yung mga websites na yon that the aim is the same, to provide students with varied listening practice and listening opportunities. So aside from that, yung structured listening kasi yun lahat na they have to listen to this specific audio kasi may ipapagawa sa kanila na related sa audio clip na yun. For example, kanina sa website na pinakita ko na okay, you have to listen to this one class kasi may activity kayo after this one. So you also have to give opportunities to your learners to enjoy. So yan nga, meron din tayong mga activities or mga podcast, for example, wherein they can listen, wala lang, for enjoyment lang. Yan. So we also have to give them opportunity to enjoy it. So I think I'll give another Zoom link na lang para matapos tong ano na to for instruction lang before we end our session for this afternoon. Sige. I'll share lang ha or I'll send another link lang kasi matatapos na to anytime. Sige po, I'll end this muna.